Let's take a little bit of a closer look at the Gospels, and we'll describe them as Jesus stories. They're hero stories in which everything in the Gospels is focused on the identity and the teaching and the actions of Christ. So, inside of that, though, there are a lot of different forms. So let's talk first about what the genre has in common. The Gospels are unique. They're unique mostly because of their content rather than their form. Their content all surrounds the hero of heroes, Jesus Christ. The characterization of the protagonist and his message are what makes the Gospels unique. And then inside of that, we have many different subgenres, and that's where we want to go with the rest of our discussion together, is what is contained in the Gospels that become familiar to us and help us to understand the life and the teaching and the work of Christ. So the Gospels are structured pretty loosely. Rather than following a strict chronological order, they will be loosely chronological, but then they will sometimes stop to structure material together that has a common theme. So if Jesus happens to teach about a thing, they will bring in other stories that discuss that same thing. And that's where the chronology will sometimes mess up because they're gathering the material for another purpose. So in that sense, the Gospels are more than a singular plot line. They're more like a collection of stories. What Jesus taught, what Jesus did, and then how people responded to it. So let's take a look at some of the different genres that appear in the Gospels. There is narrative, as we've described narrative in other lectures. You have a setting, you have characters, you have plot and action. You can chart the plot line up to a climax and a resolution. And there's always some theme along with the storyline. So we've already described the Jesus stories as a kind of hero stories. So it's rather like this. We are invited right into the role of a disciple in following Christ. A simple rule of thumb is to consider ourselves the observant traveling companions of the hero, with the goal of getting to know that person as fully as possible. So the Gospels invite us right into the life of Christ, the life of the disciples, and what Jesus is attempting to teach them. They also show us what constitutes heroic action. So a hero captures the people's imagination, serves as an inspiration, and so nobody does that better or more worthily than Christ. So now we'll look at encounter stories. These are some of my favorites. They are face-to-face dialogue in which Jesus and another person are looking at each other eye to eye, and you listen to Jesus' words, you listen to the responses of the person, and you hear the compassion and the wonder and the love of Christ. For example, you have the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. Outcast doesn't fit in any way with her culture or Jesus' culture or anybody else's culture, but you sense Jesus' compassion as Jesus encounters her, picks out a line of questioning with living water, and then points out her marriages and where she is now, and invites her to come to know him. And so that encounter helps us to understand how to maybe reach out in culture that is increasingly perhaps alienated to the wonder of the gospel. So we have the woman at the well. Remember the story of the woman taken in adultery. She is the cause of the story, but the debate is really a conflict between Jesus and those who are the accusers of this woman. And we get to watch how Jesus works that out in such a way that he can show compassion to the woman, and he can teach those who oppose Christ. He could teach them what it means to be forgiving, what it means to be compassionate. And then my favorite encounter story, it's also a conflict story, is the story of the man born blind. in which this man slowly kind of comes to realize who Jesus is, but in the process gets himself thrown out of the synagogue. But when he finds Jesus, he recognizes him and becomes a witness for who Jesus is. In the Gospels, especially toward the beginning of the Gospel, there are a number of calling stories. The favorite one is the Jesus walking by fishermen, Peter, James, John, and inviting them to follow him. They leave their nets, they leave their livelihood, and they come and follow this peripatetic rabbi, this rabbi who walks around. And so Jesus gives an invitation. It describes a little bit of their circumstances. Perhaps they're sitting at a tax table for the Romans, and Jesus walks by Matthew and says, "Follow me." And that's all we hear. Bonhoeffer is amazed that we are challenged to stand up and follow when the text gives us no clues as to why Matthew would follow, except that it's Jesus. So we get the circumstances of the person when Jesus calls them. We get the nature of the call. And then we get to that person's response. Whether it is, in the case of the disciples, a positive response, or the case of the rich young ruler, it turns out to walk away and turns out to be rejection. That's the calling stories. And then we have recognition stories. I've already mentioned the story of the man born blind. He has this growing realization of who Jesus is, what Jesus' identity is. And then by the end of the story, he's choosing to follow. And then there is the story of the thief on the cross, which I love to bring up at Easter time. At the beginning of his crucifixion, he is cursing Christ like the other thief. But there is something about the person and the character and the words of Christ, even on the cross, that bring that man to belief. And this thief turns and chastises the other one for cursing Christ and mocking him. And then he turns to Jesus and says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." A slow recognition of who Jesus is. And then I mentioned we're invited along to travel with Jesus. So in these travel stories, especially in Mark, immediately Jesus is moving on, immediately, all the time. And so nothing stands still in the narrative. Jesus is walking around and his disciples are following. And they are listening and memorizing as Jesus teaches and repeats to drive home the message that he wants for his disciples. Then we have dialogue or discourse happening in the Gospels. Dialogue is a sort of stream of consciousness. It seems to bounce around a little bit based on the responses of Jesus' audience. So you listen to the story of the bread of life, and they are given bread, and then they come back to look for more bread, and Jesus turns the definition of bread from the kind that physically satisfies to the kind that spiritually satisfies, and they will have none of it. And you listen to the dialogue as it goes back and forth. Then sometimes in these dialogues or this discourse, I love this. Jesus does this a lot. It's called the rhetoric of subversion. There is a forceful challenge to conventional ways of thinking. So we get the story of the Good Samaritan, and you hear the story of somebody who is passed by, who is a victim of crime, whose health needs attention quickly, and the religious leaders all in Jesus' story, they pass by because they don't want to get their hands dirty or their hands unclean. But a Samaritan comes by, and the rhetoric of subversion, what offends the crowd is that this is a Samaritan who stops and helps. He does the good thing. And so the audience is challenged by that. Same with the story of the prodigal son, that the father would come running to welcome a prodigal back was horrific. But it tells us of the compassion that Jesus extends to us. And so I am grateful for that offense, because it means there's room at the cross for somebody like me and somebody like you. So that's dialogue. And then we have miracle stories. These follow a particular pattern. A need is established. Jesus' help is sought. The person in need, or the friends, if you remember the friends that dug a hole in the roof and lowered their friend down to be healed by Jesus. Somebody expresses faith, or somebody expresses obedience, and Jesus performs the miracle. And then the people in the story respond well, sometimes not so well, to the miracles of Christ. You get the story of the healing of Lazarus, and then you hear that the Pharisees want to put Lazarus to death as well, like kill him again. So, couple of examples of these miracle stories. We have the story of Jairus' daughter, in which you get a story of the news that the daughter has died, and yet Jesus goes and heals her, raises her from the dead. You have the story of the centurion who expresses great faith in Jesus. Jesus, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof to hear my servant, but just say the word, speak the word only, and my servant will be healed. And then we have this curious case, the healing at the pool of Siloam, where the water gets stirred and people go into the water, and it seems like the first one who goes in is healed. And there's a man there that's lamenting. There's no one to help him into the water. Somebody always gets in there first. And so when Jesus comes and talks to him, that's his case. He wants some help getting into the water in time. And it's interesting where the faith is at that. We said in the blue box there, the friend in need, the person in need expresses faith. And there's a question about this guy, because immediately after he runs to tell the religious leaders who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. So there's the miracle stories. It's interesting when the steps are there, and it's instructive when a step is missing, like that story. And then we have the passion stories. John takes half of his book to talk about the last week of Jesus' life, and the other Gospels spend significant time on the time between the triumphal entry and Jesus' resurrection. Along the way, we get all kinds of genres popping up, and they're consistent across the Gospels. Discourse and eschatological discourse, a prediction of the future, parables, conflicts, betrayals, denials, torture, arrest, trial, crucifixion, they're all there. And so watch for them as you read through the Gospels. If you have a desire to learn more about the Gospels and the content that there is there, and you want to look through it from a literature point of view, I suggest Leland Ryken's books. The information from this lecture is taken from his book, Jesus the Hero, a guided literary study of the Gospel. Thanks for joining me.